Hello, everyone. Welcome to this latest episode of JStream on Iran, sanctions relief, and the COVID-19 crisis. We are delighted to have you. My name is Deborah Shushan, and I am the Director of Government Affairs here at JStreet. We've got a great program with you today. And I want to approach this topic by starting with indicating that there's a movement, and JStreet is supporting this movement for targeted temporary sanctions relief for Iran during the COVID-19 crisis. This has taken the form of congressional letters, one of which is led by Senator Chris Murphy, who I'll be introducing in a few minutes. There is also an effort by a group of progressive diplomacy first organizations, including JStreet, that have called on the administration to take these measures of relieving some of the sanctions pressure on Iran during this time. And JStreet is also supporting those congressional letters. So there are a few things that I want to make sure that we cover by way of giving you all a bit of an agenda during the call today. We'll be talking about the situation on the ground in Iran as the Iranian government is struggling to respond to their profound domestic health crisis. We'll talk about sanctions and how broad-based US sanctions have exacerbated the failing medical and humanitarian crisis response by the Iranian government. And we'll talk about targeted sanctions relief, how it can help, what kind of relief can be helpful, and why advocates such as JStreet see it as necessary. So we have two guests with us today who are really privileged to have. The first of which is Senator Chris Murphy, who's going to speak with us for a little while. And then I'm going to be introducing our second guest today, Ali Vaez. But I'll begin with Senator Murphy. Senator Murphy is the junior senator from Connecticut. He is a member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, as well as the Senate Committee on Appropriations. Senator Murphy has long been a leader on foreign policy issues, including in articulating a progressive foreign policy vision. Most recently, he sent a letter along with 10 of his Senate colleagues to Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mnuchin, calling for easing US sanctions on Iran that are hindering responses to the COVID-19 crisis. Senator Murphy, we are so grateful to you for taking the time to be with us today, especially during these extremely challenging times. We know that your priority, of course, must be the domestic response to the COVID-19 crisis and caring for your constituents in Connecticut. And so it really means a lot to us that you could take a little bit of time to be with us today. We're looking forward to hearing from you about the Senate response to the situation in Iran and the letter that you led with your colleagues. And if you could connect that for us to the broader progressive foreign policy vision that you've articulated, that would be fantastic. Before you start, Senator, before you start, Senator, just really quickly, I want to tell all of our audience that if they have questions, and when they have questions, they should go to the bottom of their Zoom screen and find the Q&A. If you click on Q&A, you'll see a box will pop up and you can put your questions in there and we will have an opportunity to turn to questions. With that, Senator Murphy, thank you so much, and I turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Deborah. Thanks to JStreet for having me back. This is the first time that we've convened virtually, but I've been a great supporter of JStreet since the group's inception. You've been generous enough to host me in small and large groups on a number of occasions. Your live stream today coincides with the end of the homeschooling day, and so forgive me if at any point a 8-year-old or an 11-year-old runs behind me, but we have packed quarters in a small house here. Listen, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the letter that I wrote, was signed by 10 other Democratic colleagues to Secretary Pompeo, and grateful also to be able to try to put it in some context. Let's just put one thing on the table first when we're beginning a conversation about U.S. policy towards Iran. Our sanctions policy has not worked. It has not worked. It has made the situation there worse. When President Obama left office, Iran was party to an agreement that separated them from any prospect of a nuclear weapons program in the short term. When President Obama left office, the Iranians and Iranian proxies were not shooting at American troops inside Iraq. When President Obama left office, in fact, the United States was cooperating with Iranian-backed militias inside Iraq to take the fight to ISIS. Fast forward to this moment in time, Iran is potentially back on a pathway to a nuclear weapon, having withdrawn from the JCPOA. They are presently, as we speak, either directly or through their proxies in Iraq, shooting at US troops. And we are perpetually on the precipice of a dangerous conventional military engagement with Iran. The sanctions have not worked. It has not, the maximum pressure campaign against Iran has not worked. It has not convinced Iran to come to the table on concessions regarding their nuclear program. It has not forced them to come to the table to give up the ballistic missile program. And it has not made the region any safer. And so I think that's an important pretext for a conversation about the pros and cons of providing some waivers to the Trump sanctions for medical supplies and humanitarian relief to reach Iran. Iran is still in the midst of an epidemic that they right now do not have the ability to confront. We have problems in the United States with respect to medical equipment and PPE, and we don't have global economic sanctions tightening our medical economy. Iran is simply unable right now to get what they need in order to meet the medical moment. And we believe, those who signed the letter, that the United States, first and foremost, just has a moral obligation to make sure that our foreign policy doesn't result in the knowing death of innocent people. And right now, our sanctions policy, because it is making it very hard, if not impossible, for medical supplies to reach Iran, is in part resulting in the death of individuals in that country who could be saved if our policy was different. But second, we believe that this is an opportunity to show the heart of America, to show the values of our nation, which is supposed to undergird our foreign policy. Remember, there are lots of young people in Iran who are no fans of this regime, who in fact reach out for a connection to America. Now, they're fed all sorts of propaganda by the supreme leader and his allies, but that propaganda is made a whole lot easier because of a US sanctions policy that is coming down like a ton of bricks on the Iranian people, especially at this moment of crisis. And so what we've recommended is that the administration take a couple steps. We're trying to be realistic here. We're not suggesting that the administration get rid of every single sanction that they have imposed, or frankly, that the Obama administration had imposed on Iran. What we're asking them to do is to, A, create a clear general license that would allow for humanitarian relief organizations to get those relief supplies into Iran without delay. Right now, the exception that the Trump administration talks about is an incredibly narrow one. It's an exception that, for instance, doesn't count personal protective equipment as supplies exempt from US sanctions. And so we need to create a slightly broader aperture for medical equipment to get in outside US sanctions and create that general license. Second, we need to create a financing mechanism for Iran and Iranian medical providers to be able to pay for those supplies. Some of it will be straight humanitarian supplies, but some of the problem is because the banks won't do any business with Iran for anything, they're not willing to help finance healthcare entities in Iran that want to bring in some of these medical supplies. We've got to temporarily solve that problem. And the benefit here is not just that we will have a chance at convincing the Iranian people that the things they are being fed by the regime are not true about America, but it also is potentially an opportunity to thaw relations between the United States and Iran at a moment where we are literally on a day-to-day basis ratcheting up the prospect for war, gone unnoticed, because rightly so, Americans' focus has been laser-like on the crisis in our country. We have had several incidences, almost on a daily or nearly daily basis, of Iranian proxies in Iraq firing rockets and missiles at US bases and US forces. In fact, there have been additional US troops that have been killed over the course of the last 2 months. And so we are still at a crisis moment with respect to our engagement with the Iranians. And this is an opportunity for us to have constructive engagement that may allow us to have dialogue to settle these other differences. And so this, to me, is the right moral play, but it's the right national security play as well. And listen, this, I think, fits into a broader conversation about how America has to engage with the world going forward. Because what we need to understand is that our reputation has been ruined over the last 3 years. And our reputation has been ruined in part because people around the globe see a growing divide between American rhetoric about the things we stand for, and then how we actually practice foreign policy in the world. We claim that democracy is a priority, but then the Trump administration runs around the world and cozies up to dictators and chastises and attacks our democratic allies. We claim that America is the protector of global human rights, but we have largely stood down in our defense of human rights, growing increasingly silent in the face of crackdowns in Turkey or Hungary or the Philippines. And so when we aren't willing to extend a hand to a country like Iran or Venezuela, for that matter, during their time of need, it once again convinces people that the United States just really isn't a country, an entity, a government that acts in the same way that it talks. And you know what? 30 years ago, we could get away with some of that hypocrisy because you really only had two choices. You could either align yourself with the United States or you could align yourself with the Soviet Union. That's not the case today. There are lots of suitors for the affection of communities and nations' attention around the world. And if the luster comes off permanently from the United States, then there are lots of other actors who are willing to pick up those political and economic relationships when the United States lets them fall by the wayside. And then lastly, let me say this. There's also just another realpolitik reason to do everything we can to stop the spread of the disease in Iran, the virus in Iran. Ultimately, there's no way to protect ourselves from the coronavirus today or a resurgence in the fall if we don't mount a global response. And we have not. We have not. We have not coordinated our actions with our allies in Europe. We announced a travel ban from Europe without even alerting the EU beforehand. And we clearly are not coordinating our response with our adversaries. We had withdrawn most of our personnel from China prior to that outbreak happening when we shut down the PREDICT program. And now we are engaged in sanctions policy in Iran, one of the countries that has had the largest scale outbreaks. And so if all we care about is stopping the virus from permanently ruining our nation's public health infrastructure, our economy, and leading to thousands of deaths, then frankly, we should be vigilant about cooperating on a public health basis with any country, whether they are a historical ally or adversary of the United States. And we are not doing that today. One of the conversations, and I'll leave you with this, that we have to begin right now is how we rebuild a permanent public health infrastructure around the world that is available to work with both friend and foe as a mechanism to prevent, in the future, a pathogen from becoming a threat to the United States as this virus has become. Globally, we spend around $12 billion a year on public health. Half of that is PEPFAR. So for non-AIDS related public health programming, we spend $6 billion a year. Annually, the Department of Defense spends now $730 billion a year. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't stand up defenses against conventional military attacks. Certainly, Iran and North Korea and China and Russia, would probe our weaknesses if we dramatically reduced our ability to prevent a conventional attack against the United States. But we are spending today 100 times as much money on conventional military defense, that's aircraft carriers and fighter jets, tanks and planes, as we are on public health defenses. Ask Americans today whether a virus is 100 times less dangerous to the United States than an invasion from a foreign military. The answer is staring us in the face. And so we've got a big project that needs to happen moving forward to rebuild our non-military engagement with the world, public health engagement at the top of that list. And we have an opportunity right now to send a message to the Iranian people to do the right thing from a position of conscience and to potentially lead towards a reset of relations with Iran, or at least and create an opening for a new, more functional dialogue with Iran by helping them save the lives of innocent civilians in that country. So I'm really appreciative for everything that J Street has done to lead on this effort, to help those of us who believe in the moral and national security moment available to us with respect to the U.S.-Iran relationship. I may not be able to hang around until the end of this call because I've got a couple other calls lined up, but I'm grateful for our partnership and eager to hear what comes from this meeting. Thanks for letting me join.
Thank you so much, Senator Murphy. We appreciate it so much. I know that you can't stay for the duration of the call. Do you have time for maybe one question or two before you have to jump off? That would be great. We have a question from Bill Deere, which is near and dear to the heart of us here at J Street, so I wanted to put it to you. As he writes, the administration is also refusing to supply humanitarian funding to the Palestinians. Here, Bill might editorially, he might be referring to the $75 million that Congress has appropriated for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, which the administration is refusing to disperse. So Bill's question is, do the same arguments used for Iran apply to dispersing that appropriated aid to Palestinians from both a humanitarian and U.S. generosity perspective? What's your view?
Yeah, it's not apples to apples, but we have long believed in humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people and to Palestinian territories for similar reasons, right? One, we thought it was the right thing to do, and at a moment today when the economy is, wrecked in portions of the Palestinian territory, that aid is more important than ever. But we also feel like it serves a national security imperative to the extent that Republicans and Democrats agree that an American priority is a peace process and a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians that ultimately provides for a two-state solution, a path to statehood for the Palestinians, and an end to the never-ending kinetic conflict between the two sides. And so by building up the Palestinian economy and frankly giving the Palestinians more reason to believe in a future that is aligned with a relationship with the United States and a functional relationship with Israel rather than having individuals driven towards extremist groups, we think that serves our national security interests as well. And it has just sickened me to watch this administration walk away from our humanitarian commitment to the Palestinian people, to refugee populations, to Gaza, to the West Bank, but also to walk away from a two-state solution. That's the subject for another call, but there is this, I think, very important outstanding question as to whether a two-state future is viable or whether the administration here in Washington has done so much damage to it that it is going to be nearly impossible to pick up the pieces. I refuse to believe that the pieces can't be picked up and put back together, but turning back on the relief aid right now is an incredibly important step to making sure that that opportunity is still available to us.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Murphy. I'm going to just put one more question to you, and then we'll let you go. This question comes from Mark Fitzpatrick, and I think it's a good one because he notes that there are a couple of other initiatives out there. For example, there is the AOC, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez bicameral letter on the subject of sanctions relief, which calls for substantial sanctions relief for Iran. And then there's also the recommendation that came out recently from the Biden campaign for largely technical fixes to the existing sanctions structure to facilitate humanitarian trade. So Mark's question is, to which of those approaches is your own proposal closer?
Well, I don't know the Biden campaign's proposal in detail, so I can't speak to that. Bernie and I and House members work very closely together on all of these issues. And I think what we're trying to do right now is raise as much volume as we can, right? As much commotion as we can about the need to get this right. And again, it's because as someone who spends 98% of my time right now trying to protect my own constituents in Connecticut from this virus, I believe that if we aren't out there helping the hotspots around the globe tackle this virus, then we can never adequately protect ourselves. But I also believe that in general, my responsibility is to protect the safety of my constituents. And the safety of my constituents is compromised if we continue to march down a potential path to war with Iran. Maybe we will get our hands wrapped around this virus, but if we are in a shooting war in the Middle East and my constituents, having survived coronavirus, are being sent off to fight a war of choice, then I haven't done my duty either. And so right now, you are hearing a lot of members of Congress raise these issues about our sanctions policy to Iran because we think it is A, part of our duty to respond to the virus, but B, part of our broader duty to protect our citizens. And what I generally advise my friends in Connecticut when it comes to an issue they care about is to not spend too much time worrying about how to perfectly calibrate your voice. Just raise your voice, right? So I'm sure that Vice President Biden's proposal is a good one. I know that what Bernie and others in the House are working on is important. So I would just lend your support to any of these efforts because it's just important that more people know that this is not some separate problem that has nothing to do with the public safety of our constituents. This is directly tied to the fight we are engaged in today. And however, remember, we're not likely going to be able to pass a piece of legislation through the Senate and the House and get the president's signature doing this. We're going to have to raise enough pressure to get the administration to make changes. And that can happen as long as we are all speaking truth to power on a regular basis. And obviously Bay Street provides a tremendously important forum to do that.
Senator Murphy, thank you so much. It's really our pleasure to have you today. And we want to wish you all of the best in terms of your work in combating COVID-19 domestically and taking care of your constituents in Connecticut. And we just really, really appreciate your time and thoughtful comments to us today.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, folks. So I am now excited to introduce to you our second guest, who we're very fortunate to have with us today. His name is Ali Vaez, and Dr. Ali Vaez is the International Crisis Group's Iran Project Director, consulting with all sides in the nuclear negotiations for the past few years. He led the International Crisis Group's efforts in helping to bridge the gaps between Iran and the P5+1. Those are the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany who negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran. And Dr. Vaez is renowned as one of the foremost experts on Iran's nuclear and missile programs. The subject that we are talking about today is something that Dr. Vaez has thought about and in fact written about extensively. In fact, if you are interested, I can recommend to you an International Crisis Group paper that he put out just a few days ago that is certainly worth reading. It's, if you want to look it up on the Google, it's called Flattening the Curve of U.S.-Iran Tensions. And it's going to touch on, it does touch on a lot of the things that we'll talk about today. So if you're interested and want a deeper dive, that is something to look at. But meanwhile, I'm very much looking forward to having this discussion with Dr. Vaez. The way that we'll proceed is that I have some questions that I'd like to ask him. So we'll start out with those. Meanwhile, while Dr. Vaez and I are engaging in that conversation, please do go to the Q&A and feel free to type in your question. We already have a lot of great questions. I wish I would be able to get to them all, which probably isn't going to happen, but I will look through all of the questions and try to get to as many as possible. So please do write them in the Q&A. Okay, so Dr. Vaez, the first thing that I'd like you to share with us is if you could tell us more about the situation on the ground in Iran. I'm sure our viewers are aware that Iran has become an epicenter, both regionally in the Middle East and globally in terms of this COVID-19 crisis. So if you could enlighten us a little bit as to what the situation is like on the ground and why it's gotten so bad, and how the government response there has exacerbated the crisis.
Great. First of all, Deborah, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be with J Street, and I have to say I'm in violent agreement with everything that Senator Murphy said. Now, the situation on the ground in Iran, as you well know, is quite dire. Iran is the worst hit country in the Middle East. It has the 7th highest number of infections in the world and the 5th highest number of people who have lost their lives as a result of this outbreak. And this is statistics that is coming from officials in Iran. Most experts and even WHO believes that the real numbers are much higher, probably 5-fold higher than this. And some experts that I talk to say that the number of infections might be in the neighborhood of 500,000. Now, the reason the situation got this bad this quickly is primarily due to Iranian government's mismanagement in the early phases of this crisis. They underestimated the scale and scope of this outbreak. And then we're also quite reluctant to restrict travel to China and restrict trade with China, which remains Iran's only oil customer and Iran's biggest trade partner. Because they were just afraid of alienating their best ally under the current circumstances that they're suffering from US sanctions. So the combination of mismanagement and reluctance to alienate the Chinese, I think, resulted in the rapid spread of the virus in the country. And then the government made one bad decision after another, refusing to shut down businesses, refusing to impose travel restrictions and quarantines. Primarily because, again, as a result of sanctions, they could not afford it. So you see a lot of blame game these days between Iran and the US. The Iranian officials obviously blame US sanctions for what's happening on the ground in Iran. The Trump administration blames Iranian corruption, mismanagement, and regional policies for Iran's failures. And as it's often the case in the case of Iran-US enmity, the reality is somewhere in between. There's not an either or question, it's really both sanctions and mismanagement that have resulted in this situation. I talk to people, aid workers on the ground, those who actually have an OFAC license like Relief International, Norwegian Refugee Committee, and they tell you that they are in real difficulty getting access to the kind of medical equipment and medicine that they need because of restrictions imposed on Iran, which make any banking transaction almost impossible. I mean, imagine if Government Cuomo of New York, under the current circumstances, could not access the state's funds in order to purchase ventilators. Even if you could find some funds, there was no bank that was willing to actually conduct those transactions for New York. And even if he could overcome that problem, he would still have to go to OFAC and get licenses for ventilators and PPEs, as Senator Murphy mentioned, that would take months to come through. So without any doubt, you know, a lot of more advanced countries in Europe have also mismanaged this crisis. But in the case of Iran, it's doing so with one hand tied behind its back as a result of sanctions.
Thank you so much, Ali. I wonder if you might continue with that thread and give us, I mean, for those who are not as deeply immersed as you are in the ins and outs of the sanctions regime, and especially how that has changed since the United States withdrew or violated unilaterally the JCPOA. Can you give us a sense of what that sanctions regime looks like, how extensive it is, and how it has changed?
Sure. Look, since the president withdrew from the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, in May of 2018, the US sanctions were snapped back in two installments, in August of 2018 and then in November of 2018. And since then, we have basically sanctioned anything that moves in Iran. The State Department says we've sanctioned 80% of the Iranian economy, and the remaining 20% is humanitarian goods. But the reality is that the administration took two steps that even rendered humanitarian trade quite difficult. In April of 2019, it decided to completely shut off Iran's oil exports. In the past, under the sanctions regime that the Obama administration put in place and then the Trump administration revived, Iran could sell oil to a handful of oil customers, and the oil revenues would be blocked in escrow accounts that could be used for trade with that country in items that are legal, like food, medicine, and medical products. When the administration decided to go to zero oil exports, it basically removed those waivers that allowed those countries to import oil from Iran, and with it canceled the ability of the escrow accounts to be used for humanitarian trade. So Iran actually has billions of dollars sitting in Japan, in South Korea, in India, in China, that it simply cannot get access to. Now, the second thing that the administration did was that it imposed sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran, which was already sanctioned because of alleged involvement in Iran's nuclear program, this time for support of terrorism. And this is really a radioactive label that had almost no exemptions for humanitarian trade. And eventually the administration was forced in February of this year to issue a general license called General License 8 that would allow certain humanitarian trade transactions with the Central Bank of Iran. The problem is, this is a very limited list of items. As the senator mentioned, even PPE or ventilators or CT scanners are not included. And it has a threshold of $500,000. A lot of these machines that we're talking about, like CT scans, are much more expensive than $500,000. We're talking about millions. And if you look at the number of licenses that OFAC has issued in specific cases, you see a significant drop compared to 2-3 years ago. In fact, 50% of the cases that OFAC used to receive in 2016 were reviewed and approved. And that was a much higher number, I think in the hundreds. Now we're talking about maybe 2 or 3 dozen cases, and only 10% of them have been approved in the first quarter of 2019, according to OFAC itself. So you have a bottleneck at OFAC. You have all of these restrictions that basically render humanitarian trade with Iran almost impossible. Now, the Iranians have a pretty good infrastructure, and they produce up to 97% of their own medicine. The problem, again, is that you still need raw material. And the raw material under the current circumstances, where a lot of other countries are also boosting up their medical production, is hard to find. And if you're restricted in the same way that Iran is as a result of sanctions, it makes it almost impossible for them to get access to what they need. So again, I think it's incorrect to say that sanctions are not responsible for exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Iran as a result of COVID-19 crisis, but it's also incorrect to only blame sanctions and not the Iranian government's own shortcomings.
Thank you, Ali. So you've called on the United States to revise its sanction policies to ensure minimal disruption to relief efforts. And you've suggested that the United States should do this as part of a narrow diplomatic exchange with Iran. So I wonder if you might elaborate on that a little bit, what you have in mind. What exactly are you calling on Iran to do as part of this narrow diplomatic exchange? And how do you believe that it could, as you put it, flatten the curve of US-Iran tensions?
Look, in every crisis, there's an opportunity. Before the COVID crisis, there was almost, I think, no chance of a serious diplomatic breakthrough before November elections. After all the efforts of mediation by the French president, by the Japanese prime minister failed last year, in this year, I think there was really no chance of unlocking these dynamics until the COVID crisis. Which provided both sides with, I think, a unique opportunity for a humanitarian exchange that would result in a mutually beneficial deal. So what we have suggested is that Iran would release US prisoners that is holding inside the country, because if they contract the virus and, God forbid, are hospitalized or are in serious danger, it would be a stain that would be very difficult for Iran to wash away. In the same way, the United States should not want to have a stain on its record in its relations with Iran to be responsible for Iranian lives lost as a result of this healthcare crisis. So there is a clear exchange that could happen, that Iran would release the US prisoners. It would give the president a political win because he takes personal pride in bringing Americans back home. And in return, the US would take those technical, tactical steps that Senator Murphy described, and it has been in other proposals as well, as you mentioned, Vice President Biden has suggested it, Senator Sanders has suggested it. Yesterday, 24 transatlantic officials from Europe and the US suggested it in a letter by the Iran Project and the European Leadership Network. And I think it's pretty straightforward that if the administration would clarify some of these general licenses, would increase the threshold, or would give all banks a 30-day or 45-day window, or all NGOs a 45-day window to help Iran fight the virus in the same way that the Bush administration did so in the aftermath of the Bam earthquake in 2003, and the Obama administration did in 2012. After another earthquake in Iran. So this is pretty straightforward and easy to do. Now you hear the administration often say what the Iranians want is cash. And it's cash that they want to spend on supporting their network of proxies and partners throughout the region. If you would allow me, I would explain that this is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what's happening in Iran right now. The Revolutionary Guard and the hardliners in Iran are seeing in the Rouhani administration's mismanagement of this crisis a unique opportunity to demonstrate themselves as fully capable and much more competent in crisis management. So they are the ones who have suggested about a month ago that the country should go into a lockdown. And the Rouhani administration eventually was forced to implement some version of a lockdown. They're the ones, the IRGC is the one who's going around the country and providing aid to a lot of rural places and even cities. And so for them to spend international assistance on advancing their regional agenda would be a political own goal of epic proportions that they're simply not going to commit. It's very unlikely that they would commit that. And even if that was the case, I think the humanitarian imperative should take primacy here over strategic calculations. But even strategically, if you think about it, if you fail to contain this crisis in Iran, you fail to contain it everywhere. Let's remember that the US actually has forces right next door in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And again, the failure to contain this in Iran is going to have consequences for US citizens as well. And finally, there are ways that we can direct this aid or international assistance in ways that we can ensure it doesn't go towards any kind of malign behavior. For instance, the US has allowed the Swiss government to establish a humanitarian channel for trade with Iran. There's only been one transaction that has gone through that channel of 2.3 million euros. So it's really negligible. But the US could allow, for instance, that the IMF give Iran the $5 billion loan that it has requested, and ask the Swiss humanitarian channel to manage that money for importing only medicine and medical products and basic staples into the country. So there are a lot of ways that if the administration really had a little bit of empathy, I think it could find ways of enforcing that. But unfortunately, I think they believe that the coronavirus has succeeded where sanctions failed in cutting off Iran's trade with its neighbors, in further diminishing Iran's oil exports to China, and now as a result of the drop in oil prices, even reducing further the Iranian government's revenue. So they're hoping that this would bring Iran to its knees, which I think is a major miscalculation. And again, results in the US coming across as completely insensitive to the suffering of Iranian people, which will have long-term consequences for the relationship between the two countries.
So Dr. Vaez, just one more question for me before I turn to some questions from our audience. The last question for me is actually a kind of a devil's advocate kind of question. As I'm sure that you saw yesterday, Secretary of State Pompeo released a quote unquote fact sheet on what he called Iran's sanctions relief scam, right? I'm sure you've seen this. And there are a whole bunch of points, many of which you've already, I think, very successfully debunked. One additional one that I want to raise is the argument by the Trump administration through Secretary Pompeo that the Iranian regime actually has plenty of money to fight the COVID-19 crisis, and they would be able to do so very capably if they only wanted to, but they have rejected humanitarian assistance and medical supplies and even kicked out a Doctors Without Borders team. So how do you respond to the Trump administration on that?
Again, that is based on a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Look, as I said, the Iranians have a lot of money that is frozen outside of the country because of US sanctions. And they say, the Iranians say, and we quote a senior Iranian official in our report that you referred to, who said, we don't want any handouts from the US. We're not a poor country. We want the US to unshackle our hands so that we can take care of our own people. If the US were to allow Iran access to those assets, there would be no need for any international assistance or an IMF loan. The second issue is, yes, there is money probably inside the country, and President Rouhani managed to convince the Supreme Leader to provide 1 million euros from Iran's National Development Fund yesterday. The problem is, how do you get this money to foreign banks and to Swiss companies or to German companies to buy ventilators? Again, no bank will process any money that is coming from the Supreme Leader's bank accounts or the Iranian central bank because of US sanctions. And it's also quite interesting that the administration does not see its own contradictions. If indeed the Supreme Leader of Iran has $300 billion in a slush fund, then there is no point in maximum pressure strategy because the Iranians would have enough cushion to survive for another 10 years, if that is indeed true. But this is an administration that has gone around the world, try to propagate this chilling effect of sanctions in ways that Iran becomes so radioactive that no country, no bank is willing to work with Iran. And then when we are in a public health crisis like this one, they say, oh, Iran has money and has access to its funds. Obviously, each side of this argument is false. If Iran had that much money, it really demonstrates that maximum pressure has failed. If Iran, does have this money and can use it to access banks and purchase whatever it needs, again, it shows that maximum pressure has failed. And it's really interesting that the administration tries to engage in propaganda, to be honest with you, in order to cover up for its failure to demonstrate what is, I think, a moral imperative in this case.
Thank you, Ali. So we have a number of questions from our audience. If there are folks with additional questions, you can go to the Q&A, type those in, make them please as brief as possible. So the first question that I want to raise from our audience is from Peter Fry, and it's a question about other JCPOA signatories and whether they are pressuring the United States to loosen sanctions, what they are trying to do in terms of helping Iran to deal with its COVID-19 crisis.
Yes, they are. Almost every member of remaining member of JCPOA signatories has come up with public messaging asking the United States to relax sanctions. The United Nations Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, a lot of international organizations have come out and asked the US to relax the sanctions. But the administration is just simply turning a blind eye on all of these demands. Interestingly, France, Britain, and Germany, who have put in place a special purpose vehicle, a banking channel for actually preserving their humanitarian trade with Iran, managed to conduct a $500,000 transaction a few days ago related to export of medical devices from Germany to Iran. So that's important, that's a good news. But I'm afraid the administration does not like this channel, which is called Instrument for Exchange of Trade. It's called INSTEX, because it believes that it's a mechanism that has been designed to go around US sanctions. And unlike the Swiss channel that works under the supervision of OFAC and has a lot of requirements in terms of reporting and due diligence that meets OFAC's standards, INSTEX has been designed basically not to use the global financial system and therefore to go around US sanctions. So I'm afraid if INSTEX becomes too successful, the US is going to try to kill it. If it becomes a failure, I think it will be another disappointment for the Iranians that might push them to further escalate their ramp up their nuclear program or escalate tensions in the region.
Great. So the next question, which I'm going to bring up because it really piggybacks on the one that you just answered, is from Molly O'Neill. And I think you already answered part of her question. She wanted to know regarding financing, why not just use the INSTEX mechanism? And I think you've explained why the Trump administration is not particularly interested in that. She also asks, why not let Iran export some of its oil as an alternative mechanism rather than just loosening sanctions?
That's a good question, Molly. Look, the problem with INSTEX is partly a problem that the Swiss humanitarian channel also has, which is the problem of financing. In the case of INSTEX, you need to have Iranian exports that would build to Europe, that would build credit for European exports to Iran. And again, as a result of sanctions, Iran's main export to Europe, which was oil, has been cut off. So there's not enough revenue generated that would be sufficient for major purchases of medical devices and medicine from Europe. And that's why we're talking about transactions that are really minimal. Again, as I said, in the case of the Swiss channel, 2 million euros. In the case of INSTEX, 500,000. So it's really not a lot. Why wouldn't the US allow Iran to sell some oil? The problem is, again, if you are the Trump administration who looks at this issue in, I would say, purely ideological terms, and you believe that this is a regime that is on the brink of economic collapse and even political collapse, and the president, I think, hears from the Secretary of State all the time that this regime is going to fall by this fall. If that's the case, then why would you throw a lifeline to a regime like that? I think the view in the Trump administration is that because of coronavirus and the compounded effects of this crisis and sanctions, Iran is in a much worse situation than it was a few months ago when the economy had adjusted to sanctions and was starting to stabilize. In fact, the IMF had predicted that Iranian economic growth, GDP growth, would plateau around 0% this year, which compared to last year, which was around -10%, was an improvement. But now, as a result of coronavirus crisis, I think Iranian economy would shrink probably around -20%. And so that's a godsend for an administration that had put all of its eggs in the basket of squeezing Iran economically. And unfortunately, I think they're too confident in their approach to change it at this stage.
Okay, so we just have about 5 minutes before we need to wrap up. So I'm gonna try to throw a few more questions out there. I want to apologize to those who did put questions into the Q&A that I don't have time to get to. We've had a lot of great questions. So the next question comes from Eric Selkov. And the question is this, and I think it takes off of the comment that Senator Murphy made when he talked about the fact that there are still Iranian-backed militias in Iraq who are attacking US troops. And his question is, when sanctions have been removed in the past from Iran, Iranian leaders have just made those available to the leadership and not to the public. So why do you think this time would be any different? And also, why help the leadership when they are actively killing our troops in Iraq?
Look, this is, again, one of those myths that has been put out there for a long time, but it's really not accurate. We published in 2018 a report that is called The Illogic of Sanctions. And we basically looked at the 40-year track record of Iran's economic performance and 40-year track record of sanctions. Iran's regional behavior. And you quickly realize that there is actually no correlation between the two, meaning that times that Iran had very bad economic situation as a result of oil price drops or as a result of its own issues, and the economy was shrinking and the inflation was really high, unemployment was going to the roof. Nevertheless, the Iranians were still supporting Hezbollah and other groups because they see those groups as their weapon system, given their weakness in conventional military capabilities. And so their support for these groups is not a function of how much money they have in their bank account. It's a support of their threat perception. And so the more we threaten them, the more they would rely on these groups to look after their own security. That's number one. And again, there's a track record that we can look into it. And number two is, again, it will be political suicide for any Iranian politician under the current circumstances that the Iranian people are suffering so much as a result of this confluence of different crises, that I think it would be, if the goal is to undermine Iranian politicians, there's nothing like allowing them to commit another own goal of epic proportions by spending this money in the region, which I think is very unlikely. Was there a second part to this question that I missed?
No, I think, oh, sorry, about killing our own troops, but I think you, yeah.
Look, I mean, the reality is what has resulted in the Iranians and, Iran and the US were fighting the same enemy in Iraq. They were fighting ISIS almost in parallel between 2014 and 2018. There was no attacks against US forces by Shia militias in the region. What has changed since 2018? It's maximum pressure policy. So as long as these dynamics that have created a situation in which we have come 3 times to the brink of a military confrontation with Iran in the past 12 months are in place, which is US maximum pressure on the one hand, Iranian maximum resistance on the other, then these dynamics will continue. Somebody will have to break this vicious cycle, and I think the onus is on the stronger party, which is the United States. And let me end with this quote from Alexei Tocqueville that I really love, which is, America is great because it's good. If America stops being good, it will stop being great.
Thank you so much for that. So the very last question I have for you in our minute left then, Dr. Vaez, comes from Anthony Shafton. And he just asks very simply, do you think that there is any chance that the Trump administration is going to agree with you and with Senator Murphy and actually agree to temporary sanctions relief for Iran? Are you optimistic at all?
I'm not holding my breath at all. And to be honest with you, I think the apex of the crisis was a few weeks ago. If they wanted to do it, they should have done it then. And it really appears to me that this would be another missed opportunity and another item on the long list of grievances between the two countries that unfortunately would poison relations for years to come.
Indeed. Well, at the end of that fact sheet that I mentioned, Secretary Pompeo wrote, as he's often said, the United States will continue to support the needs and aspirations of the Iranian people, who are the longest suffering victims of the Iranian regime. Unfortunately, US policy is exacerbating the suffering and not helping. Dr. Vaez, we appreciate so much you're taking the time to join us today. This has been an extremely informative webinar, certainly for me, and I hope also for our viewers. Thank you to Senator Murphy also and his team for joining us. And thank you to our audience, and hope everyone stays safe out there, stays healthy. This concludes our call. Thanks so much.